All right, we're going. How's it going, David?
Very good. How are you?
Doing good. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat with me.
Anytime.
Cool. Well, I mean, it's
glad to be here.
Cool. Well, good to hear it. I mean, this is a topic that I don't discuss often with my friends. You know, it's not in our circles. But I was really curious to run across your book and kind of dig into this a little bit, because it's something that, like, at least being born in the U.S., it was just like, yeah, it's a democracy, and that's what it's been. And I never really thought about where it came from much, or how it started, or, you know, if there's anything better, or where we're heading with it, or, you know, any of that stuff. So I'm glad to have found you.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. And, you know, I don't know if you want to talk about first about where democracy came from and what we learned about democracy in the U.S. and what I say in the book and how we differ from the standard story, perhaps, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah.
So at least what I learned in school, and probably what you and others learned in school as well, is that democracy is sort of like this unique thing that was invented at one place and one time, like maybe ancient Athens, and then it disappeared in ancient Greece after a while. And then you might learn about city republics in Italy during the Renaissance, or things like Magna Carta in England, and then eventually somehow democracy arose in the U.S. With American independence. And so you get this impression from that whole story that democracy it's almost like a torch that was being passed from one place to another over time.
Right.
And if the torch went out, then that was going to be a problem. And so, you know, if whoever is holding the torch at the time is responsible for all democracy at all places. And I think what's really interesting, if you start poking around and looking how other human societies have governed themselves, there's pretty good stance to say that, and this is what I say in the book, that democracy was actually invented by a lot of different societies in a lot of different places at a lot of different times. It's not like it was just, the torch theory doesn't work. It arose independently by many different people. It's such a natural thing to think of. Why shouldn't people be able to govern themselves? That it's, when you think further about that, it's like, well, why couldn't people invent that independently? And they did. And so what I think we can suggest is, whether you're talking about Native American societies or pre-colonial Africa or ancient Mesopotamia, there's a lot of different societies that govern themselves democratically in ways that look very different from our democracy today. But nonetheless, I think we could say it was democracy in one way, shape, or fashion.
Okay. Well, I think we should, you know, it's kind of a dumb question, I feel like, for me, but it's something that I had to look up. So I feel like listeners are probably curious about it too. So what, can you give like just a definition of democracy?
Yeah, that's a really good way to start out, because for a lot of people today, if you ask them what is democracy, and a lot of people say, well, it's elections. Right? That's sort of the cornerstone of our democracy. We have different candidates from different parties who are running for office. We obviously have a pretty huge, momentous election coming up, and that's what democracy is. And that democracy, if you're choosing your representatives or your presidents or prime ministers by election, you're a democracy. And if you're not doing that, then, well, that's not a democracy. Now, if you go back to the funny thing is, the Greeks themselves didn't talk about elections when they defined democracy. The Greeks had this word demokratia, which simply means that the people, the demos, had power, kratos. And so for them, the definition of democracy was the people having power. And so if you can think of the people having power through means that aren't elections, like say that I was the ruler and you and others governed jointly with me in an assembly or a council, even if you didn't elect me, I might have to get your participation and your consent and your cooperation in order to rule. Then it's possible to imagine societies where everybody pitched in and everybody had their say, even if they weren't necessarily electing the person at the center. So that's sort of the difference between modern democracy, which I think is characterized by selecting people by elections, and early democracy, as I call it, that often didn't involve elections, but still gave the people a lot of power.
Okay. Yeah, that helps a lot. So I really appreciate you kind of explaining that. So it's really just the fact that, I mean, broadly speaking, democracy is just the people having power.
Yeah, exactly. I think
Okay.
that's what it comes down to.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I asked that question. That's extremely helpful. Okay. So, and then yeah, I mean, you kind of make the case that this democracy started, early before we were taught with like, why do you think we were taught the torch theory, like you said, sort of?
I don't know. I don't know. It maybe it comes with a little bit. So look, it is true. The U.S. I think was unique in having the first country to have a modern democracy based on universal suffrage at the time for free white males, of course.
Right.
And we were first in that regard, right? So the English had their parliament for a long time. They had a shared form of governance between crown and parliament, but they didn't get to universal suffrage till 1918.
Okay.
Believe it or not, whereas we had that much earlier. So, it's certainly the case that there were a lot of exceptional, even unique things about the U.S. in terms of democracy, but that's just an innovation of one sort of type of democracy. It's not creating the phenomenon itself. And so I think that's why the torch theory took off, and why I believe just if people look around more to other societies, they'd sort of recognize that there's a lot of other ways to skin a cat when it comes to democracy, so to speak.
Sure. Okay. That's why I love this podcast and learning about all this stuff and talking to people like you, is that I feel like all the stuff that I was taught in grade school is just like a portion of the truth. There's just so much more to dig into.
Yeah, and we're learning. That's the thing. We're learning as new materials become available, and we start thinking about old things in new ways. That's what helps get us there.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, it's kind of, we kind of need to think of it as like democracies were kind of. So it wasn't like it was one thing that started it. Were they naturally occurring in different places? Why were they popping up at different societies? Or
so I think democracy was a naturally occurring thing in human societies, but it wasn't inevitable, because there's been a lot of democracies over time, but there's also been a lot of autocracies. And so democracy was more likely to happen when those who a central ruler didn't have something like a bureaucracy and military composed of subordinates that would allow them to just do things on their own, to rule on their own. It happened, if you think of a society like the Huron and the Iroquois in Eastern North America. These are societies where they had chiefs, but chiefs had no real power because they had no independent resources. They didn't have subordinates that they could sort of order around and say, go do this, go do that. They didn't have a military. They relied on the people, on members of society to do anything, basically. Yeah. And so it's in those environments, I think, that democracy was much more likely to emerge. And it was less likely to emerge in environments where somehow rulers got ahead and were able to construct a bureaucratic state that they used to rule, not literally on their own, but on their own via subordinates, as opposed to ruling through the people.
Okay, I see. So was like, broadly speaking, is that kind of the two things that we've seen that govern people is democracy and autocracy?
That's right. For most of human history, that I think it's useful to distinguish between those types. And it's useful then to recognize some differences, and that typically early democracies, unlike our democracy, early democracies were often quite small in terms of numbers of people or how or the area that they were spread out over. Whereas early autocracies sometimes could cover very large areas. If you think of ancient China or some of these empires that existed in Mesoamerica and South America before European conquest, like the Aztecs or the Incas, there was this scale phenomenon where, for some reason or another, democracy tended to be much harder to sustain at a large scale. And I think a lot of it has to do with early democracy involved a lot of face-to-face contact and discussion.
Oh, I see. Okay. Because, yeah, just kind of on a practical level, you would need, if you were a democracy back then, without kind of technology or something, everyone would kind of need to be there or face to face, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. Just if you're thinking about prior to modern means of communication, like we're using for this podcast, then if the people are really participating all the time, then it's much easier if you're talking about a town or a village or a small community or maybe a society that's made up of few small communities that get together from time to time. And for one reason or another, and I don't think we actually know the answer to this, autocracy was able to extend over much larger distances than democracy was.
Right. Okay. So do you have any specific examples of early democracies that you want to share, that you like or anything? And also what is the year or the time frame of those that we're discovering?
Well, the time frame ranges a lot because I've already mentioned the example of the Huron people who were in present-day Ontario and the Iroquois in New York State, and so those would have been societies that were existing up until conquest by Europeans and were early democracies quite late in the day. But then there are also examples that are very, very old. So in ancient Mesopotamia, it's fascinating that there was a sort of alternation between individual cities ruling themselves for some periods as early democracies, and then at other periods, someone would manage to get a leg up and sort of conquer all the cities and rule on his own, together with a military, and a bureaucracy. And so there's this one great example called the Kingdom of Mari, and this is all based on what people have done, looking at old sort of cuneiform writings and trying to infer what happened at the time. And there were clearly councils and assemblies and some sort of popular participation in governance. And we're talking about the second millennium BC here. So that's a long time ago. And then what happened is they ruled independently for a while, and then they got conquered by Hammurabi, who had the famous Hammurabi's law code that we sometimes learn about in school. So those are just two examples. It could go on. There's others in Africa or elsewhere that really suggest that this phenomenon was pretty widespread.
Wow. Okay, man, that's so cool. That's just such a mind-blowing idea. So I'm glad we're learning about this and you're sharing it.
Yeah, it's really the way I felt when I started to write this book. I was trying to explain why. Well, I was thinking about just Europe, China, and the Middle East, and I was saying why democracy emerged in Europe and not the other two places, which is true. But then as I started to dig deeper, I said, hey, wait a minute. There are a lot of other societies that weren't Middle East, China, or Europe that nonetheless had some of these democratic features. And so I shifted from thinking, wow, Europe was unique and exceptional, to say Europeans were basically lucky. A lot of people started off with early democracies, but Europeans managed to keep it that way.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So what happened in China? Why did democracy decline there?
Well, China from a really, really early date, 2,000 years BC or thereabouts, we have a phenomenon where, from what we know, you get a form of rule based upon kings. They weren't yet calling themselves emperors, but kings from a very, very early date in the Shang dynasty. And you have examples of a very hierarchical society spread out over a large territory, and rulers ruling through subordinates of a sort. And one of the things that helped them sustain that, I think, is there was a sort of a form of agriculture they had, a form of high yield, very intensive agriculture that sort of made things very regular and observable for rulers, so that they could extract things from society in terms of food and taxes, without having to sort of rely on the cooperation of the people that much. And so for all those reasons, I think they got going on this autocratic trajectory from a very early date. So it's not like the Mesopotamian example where they alternated back between periods of empire and then periods of council or assembly governance. Those examples in Chinese history of council or assembly government are almost absent.
Oh, okay, I see. And so, just to dive deeper, help me understand a little bit more. Like, the reason was just because the reason that it stayed, sort of autocratic was that they just had predictable resources that, the ruler could go take, essentially.
Yeah, I think that helped. That helped, and that if things were more predictable, if the ruler knew, if you were ruling and I was producing, and you knew basically how much I could, how much of my crop I could produce each year, and therefore how much of my crop you could take, it made your problem of extracting resources easier. Whereas, say that you were ruling over a community where you didn't really know what they could produce, you might want to invite them along to say, like, okay, what do you think is possible? What's going to be production? What's the appropriate tax rate? And of course, that only works if the ruler and people then are if there's some commonality of objective for what the money is getting spent on, like, say, external defense or something like that. Because if the rule is just purely extracting, then of course I'm not going to tell you what I can produce under any circumstances. But as long as there's a little bit of overlap, commonality of interest, then yeah, you do get this very interesting phenomenon where it could be good for a ruler and citizen to form an assembly or a council.
Okay, that makes sense. That's interesting because it's such a like a practical thing almost, where, like, today the government can see all the money that comes in through my bank account. They have exactly, precisely, they know, but you wouldn't know back then. Exactly.
No, exactly. So that's someone commented on the book, and they said, well, what you show, there's the democracy. If you want to understand the rise of the rise of early democracy, then follow the money, basically, or follow. Yeah.
Okay, man, that's interesting. I love learning about that. And then, so what's the story with the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East is fascinating because if you think about China, really starts off autocratic from the get-go and stays that way. And Europe starts off with this more participatory form of governance. Obviously, during the Middle Ages, if it's a king and a few nobles and a council, we're not going to say that's truly democratic, but it's a lot different than what you found in China. So there's this commonality of collective rule in Europe throughout. But the Middle East kind of shifts, and it's really fascinating because if you look at, say, tribes in what we know of pre-Islamic Arabia, there were groups that followed very clearly an early democratic pattern where there were leaders who didn't have much independent authority. They had no bureaucracy. They had no state. These were cases where often groups where people would be very mobile. And they could exit. If you were unhappy with me as a ruler, you could just take off and go elsewhere and find someone else. Wow. And so the exit imperative led to a more horizontal collective form of governance. And this persisted even, after the initial Islamic conquest for some time. There's this principle called shura in the Quran, which means government, which basically means the need for consultation in rule. So it's nothing to do with Islam itself that led to the shift towards a more autocratic form of rule. What happened is with the Islamic conquest, they got so big so quickly that they ran up against that barrier I mentioned before, that autocracies in early times could function at scale, whereas democracies, no one had yet figured out a way for democracies to function at scale. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happened in the Middle East is with the Islamic conquest, as soon as the Arab armies invaded Iraq, they sort of inherited someone else's state, because there was this empire called the Sasanian Empire that had the whole bureaucracy, military, high yield agriculture where you could easily monitor and see what people were making, and therefore a very autocratic form of rule that went all hand in hand with that. And so when the Arab armies conquered this part of Iraq, in which the Sasanian Empire was located, they just sort of got rid of the leaders, took over the bureaucracy, and then reverted to becoming autocrats themselves. So it's a dramatic shift from early democracy towards autocracy. Yeah. Wow,
that's good. That's a crazy story.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Man, okay. So should we jump ahead to kind of what America does now, do you think? Is that a good way to go?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So what's the deal there? How does that kind of form?
Okay, as in how democracy forms in America?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, whatever you think that would be the best way to take us. But yeah, because the U.S. is different, like you mentioned, right?
Yeah, the U.S. is different, and I think let me start off with England, and because England is important as a precedent, but then the U.S. gets to England it starts off in getting towards a new type of democracy, but America is the first to get all the way there. Okay. And so in again, for all the way there for free white men, not for a lot of other categories of people. Right. So, you know, in some sense, you couldn't say that America wasn't a democracy until 1965, right? So,
yeah, true.
So in England, there's a lot of parliaments and assemblies throughout Western Europe in the medieval era. In England, that starts off not looking terribly unique in that regard. But this funny thing happens very early on in England. So in most of these Western European countries where kings brought together assemblies and parliaments, the towns and communities that would send deputies or representatives or delegates to these assemblies bound them with mandates, and it would sort of be like if you were sending me as your delegate or whatever you wanted to call me, and you would say, David, yeah, you can agree to X, Y, and Z, but you can't agree to A, B, and C, or this is the max we're willing to do, and that's it. And that any deviation from that, you'd have to come back. I'd have to go back to see you again, and you'd have to agree to a deviation, right? And so this made for an incredibly cumbersome style of decision making, and there wasn't even a principle of majority rule. Whereas in England, from the 14th century, the system of mandates, as it was called, goes out the window. Mandates disappear, and very early on, we have a phenomenon where the individual representatives to Parliament come with full powers, and that means that they're able to decide and negotiate and decide on things as they see fit. They'll need to go back to their constituencies eventually, but they don't have a strict written mandate that binds what they can do. And there's also a principle of majority rule that emerges, and saying that previously sometimes a community might say, well, we don't like this decision, we're just going to opt out. That was no longer possible. And so right there, you get a principle of modern governance. That's how our Congress works today, right? Of course, is that individual states sometimes would like to opt out of decisions, but they don't get to its majority. We don't have mandates anymore. We sometimes have like the Republican contract with America in 1994, where they tried to say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, but the only way in which we can display that we're unhappy with our representatives is just not to reelect them. So that's a key feature of modern democracy. And then the thing is, what happens with England, though, is that they didn't get all the way to universal suffrage. There were people in England in the 17th century who were talking about universal suffrage. And sorry if I'm going on too long, but it's a long story.
No, this is great. Yeah, no, I love this.
And there's this group called the Levelers, who had been part of the English Civil War, and they said, "Well, let's have universal suffrage." Well, that didn't go down too well, even among the people who had overthrown the king at the time. And so there's something different about America that led to this principle of a broad suffrage. And I think what happened in the early colonies, if you look at it, that initially a lot of the people who established the colonies wanted to rule them in a top-down fashion. But what then happened was that they needed people, and the people who arrived there was a lot of land. If the people didn't like what you told them, they could just take off. And so you get this exchange of voting in assemblies in order to attract people and sort of keep them on side.
Right. Okay.
And this happens in the case of the Virginia Company. It's quite explicit. They say, "Oh, you should have an assembly. You should be able to vote, blah, 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 blah," in order to keep people on side. And so it's the natural environment of land abundance and labor scarcity, and the fact that people could just move elsewhere, that leads to this tradition of very broad suffrage for free white males in a lot of the colonies, way, way, way before 1776.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Because I just did because it's the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower now. So I was just talking to somebody about the Mayflower Compact, and that's like, I guess some people consider that like an early like the basis for what became the U.S.?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's two interpretations of the Mayflower, and there's similar moments in other. Massachusetts is a great example of early voting in the towns of Massachusetts. It happens in Virginia too, in Maryland and elsewhere. There are two different ways to read the Mayflower Compact. One is that it's part of the torch theory, right? That, the people showed up and they had the torch with them. Yeah. And the other is just to say that the Mayflower Compact happened because anyone who wanted to rule in a top-down fashion just didn't have the ability to do that.
Right, yeah. I mean, that makes total sense when you put it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's eventually what led to, the U.S. Constitution and 1776 and all that we learned?
Yeah, that's right. And then, the flip side to all that, of course, the tragic side is that needing labor also means that you get a lot of Africans who come over who are brought over who are enslaved.
Sure.
So that's the 1619 element. And it's responding to the same problem, labor scarcity. And the difference is that Africans who were brought over as slaves, they don't have very good exit options. They wouldn't have initially spoken the language. They wouldn't have the same ability to just sort of blend off as British settlers would have done. So you get the opposite outcome for that. So it's really these underlying conditions of land abundance and labor scarcity lead to slavery for some and freedom for others.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because when you think about it, it's like, there's the democracies coming in and all that stuff. But for a lot of people, they didn't get that.
No, exactly. And I think that, the 1619 Project for the New York Times was really good at emphasizing that and saying, like, look, there's and I just think that there are two sides to the same coin driven by these same underlying conditions. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good to know. So the last chapter of your book is called The Ongoing Democratic Experiment, correct?
Correct.
So why say experiment? Why use that term?
Well, I think experiment because we tend to think, well, the U.S. has been around for so long. We've been at it for about as long as the Athenians were at it in terms of like successful democracy. And so if you think that early democracy was around for several thousands of years, then our own country, which was arguably the first modern democracy, if you think about however many years we've been around now, 240 something. That's still pretty recent. And so I think it's an experiment, and I think it seems all the more like an experiment because the last decade or so, I don't know, last decade, last 15 years, you choose your date, has reminded us that there are a lot of reasons to think that, our democracy is not inevitably going to survive, and there's points of fragility there. Right. And so we need to think about that. And when we need to think about that, we need to use the long history of democracy to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to kind of get your mind thinking about that again, especially with the timelines of how long we've been around. Because, being born in the U.S. and taught in grade schools, it's like, this is the best thing that's out there. We've got the best, and it's going to last forever. Yeah,
and I think that's one thing that got swept under the rug. What we were taught in school, you're taught in school, you say, well, maybe you heard about like direct democracy in Athens, where it was just people went themselves. And then you learn that representative democracy happened, and therefore representative democracy could happen over a much larger territory. Right. True. But we still have a problem of scale. The U.S. is a very big country with people of very, very different tastes and preferences and desires, and spread geographically large in number. And maybe we need to remember that we still have a problem of scale. It's an issue making things work and making people avoiding a problem where people just distrust the government in Washington.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in doing all this research and everything, do you have any ideas or insights of things we may want to tweak in our current system or change?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we need to realize is that in modern democracy, it's great. Everybody gets to vote. Participation is very broad. But for the vast majority of us, that's the only way we participate politically. Yeah. And if that's the only way you participate politically, then that may get to feel unsatisfying if all you can do is vote every 2 to 4 years and see whether you're happy or whether you're not happy. And so I think there have been times, like in the early republic in the United States, some of the leaders realized, wow, we've got to keep people connected with the government in Washington. So they did things like one of the reasons why the Postal Service distributed newspapers anywhere for only 1 penny was because this thing called the Postal Service Act of 1792 said we got to keep people informed. We got to people informed to keep them connected with the center of government. So sometimes keeping people connected with government depended on the government itself making investments to see that happens. And I think we might want to go back to that precedent and see what could be done along those lines.
Okay, go back to the precedent of just trying to inform people.
Yeah,
deeper?
try and inform people, keep them connected. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I mean, are we because now it feels like I almost give up on stuff because there's just too much information for me to get to.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem today. It's not, if you think of like someone in like 1783 in a farm, I don't know, in Pennsylvania or something like that, that was either no information or they got a newspaper. Yeah. Whereas today we could drown in information and disinformation. So it's no longer an issue of do you have the information? I think it's also a question of what the quality of the information is. Yeah. And how much you trust that information. And one of the things that's unfortunate, we've seen a lot of disappearance of a lot of local news outlets. Mm-hmm. It's happening in the U.S. It's also happening in other countries like the U.K., where just the nationalization of news. And so people are actually, although surveys show that people are much less trusting of national media than they are of local media, which is interesting. People are also more trusting even today of local and state governments than they are of national governments, which again comes back to this question of maybe that's showing us again that democracy is easier to maintain at a smaller scale than at a larger scale. Yeah, right. Man, this is so interesting. I like kind of thinking about this and diving into it with you. So yeah, I mean, so the main thing about your book and what you're trying to hope to do is kind of just, bust some myths about democracy and stuff like that. Is there anything that we maybe didn't cover or miss that you want to get to? No, I think that's that. You hit the main point perfectly, and that if we want to understand where we are today, we need to go back to the deep history of democracy and sort of rethink things. And if we rethink things, that will help us to better understand where we are and what we need to do. Right. Okay. Very cool. Is there any? So it just is. To me, it's fascinating to think about what could be done or what could be changed. Are there any, other states besides the U.S. that you see doing things that are maybe in the correct direction or different? Well, I think there's other societies like if you go to Germany or Denmark, people are still much more trusting of government. Those are much more cohesive. And I wonder whether some of there are different ways of participating politically in a lot of the protests we've seen recently. I mean, the George Floyd protests were remarkable for how many different communities protested. Mm-hmm. And that's a form of political action. So I wonder if that's not something that people need to think about, not violent protest, of course, but right. Peaceful protest as a way of expressing your views. And again, getting back to that idea that you're actually participating politically somehow, and you don't just have to wait every 4 years and, cast your ballot and then see how that all adds up. Yeah. Because if it's just that, I don't know, people. I mean, it comes back to the Greek definition. If the people have power, then it's a democracy, right? Well, if the people have sort of ceded power we all just say, I distrust the government in Washington, I don't care, or whatever, then that's not a very stable foundation for a democracy. Yeah, no, that's a good point about because personally I feel, just kind of, frustrated and like I just don't have much influence on this kind of stuff. So I don't spend a lot of time, focusing on things that are outside of my control. But it's like you said, it's because I don't feel like I have the power, I guess, really. I can just vote every couple of years. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think going back in time, there used to be a lot more like local clubs and things and societies and things that people would participate in. And a lot of that stuff's kind of withered on the vine. And a lot of it is Well, look, one of the great things about our technological developments is like you and I can link up and do a podcast like this when this would have been unimaginable. So that's a new form of discussion. But it is true that there are other forms of participation that people are engaged in that are less common today. I guess we're kind of more atomized.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, well, David, this is great. Let's mention your book for folks listening. It's the Decline and Rise of Democracy: A Global History from Antiquity to Today. Anywhere specific we should send folks to grab a copy of that?
Right on Amazon.
Amazon, it's got it all. Okay, perfect. I'll have a link for folks listening there. Anywhere else you want to send people or resources or anything like that?
My website, if you want to find out about anything I write about, Stasavage.com.
Okay, cool. Got that. We'll have a link for that in the description as well. And this was great. Thank you so much, David. I really had fun. Thank you. And I appreciate this conversation.
Anytime. Thank you.